Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Oak Red List Project, Main Threats to Oaks and Saving Oaks from Extinction. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our programs to a broader audience. In case you're not familiar with the organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. Our Focus on Sustainability partners are the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, Rescape California, the American Public Gardens Association, and the Ecological Landscape Alliance. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Murphy Westwood. Dr. Westwood is Director of the Global Tree Conservation Program at the Morton Arboretum, whose mission is to save trees from extinction through global collaborations. Dr. Murphy works closely with colleagues from botanical gardens, universities, and other sectors in strategic locations worldwide and the United States to develop conservation projects targeting key threatened tree species, especially oaks. She also creates tools, guidelines, publications, and other resources to build capacity and catalyze action for tree conservation. Dr. Murphy leads the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak, is a Global Tree Conservation Officer for Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and works to build support for the Global Trees Campaign, the only global conservation program dedicated to saving all of the world's threatened species. Welcome, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my slide up. Thank you, Penny. Thank you to the organizers of the sustainability webinar. I'm excited to be here today. And my talk is going to be focused on oaks, and it follows on from a wonderful presentation that Tim Boland of Poly Hill Arboretum gave last week also about oaks. And Tim's talk, if you caught that, was horticulturally focused and a wonderful tour of the beautiful oaks of the eastern United States. Today, what I would like to talk about is more of the threatened oak species that we have in the world and why oaks are so important to conserve. So I'm going to start with an introduction to oaks. I'll make it brief because Tim gave a really good intro last time. And then I'm going to talk about oaks and the Morton Arboretum and why we are interested in the oak genus. I'll introduce the IUCN Red List and describe how and why we use that. And then I'm going to talk about the results of our Oak Red List project, which we undertook over the past 5 years. And then I'll discuss some conservation efforts that we have underway through the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak and many other partners that are addressing some of the challenges that we have found that oaks are facing in the world. And I'll wrap up with how you can help, suggestions, and some resources to direct people. So the oak genus, Quercus, is part of the beech family, the Fagaceae, which includes chestnuts, chinkapins, stone oaks, among a few other genera. And you know that you're looking at an oak if you see a fruit that is a nut, an acorn is what we call it. It's inside a cap called a cupule. The leaves are undivided with spiral arrangement, and the flowers are borne in separate male and female catkins. And there are about 430 species of oaks around the world. They're mostly in the northern hemisphere, but they do creep into the southern hemisphere in some places. They're predominantly trees or woody shrubs. They can be deciduous or evergreen, and they inhabit a wide range of different habitats and ecosystems, from cool, temperate climates like here in the Midwest. I'm outside of Chicago. Actually, it's very cold here today. I would say frigid even. All the way down to the tropical forests in around Mexico and in Southeast Asia. So a really wide-ranging tree group. And oaks are incredibly important. They have great ecological value. They really form the backbone of many of the forests in the US, Mexico, Europe, China, and Southeast Asia as well. They're what we call keystone species because they provide such important food and habitat and ecosystem services, like purifying air and water and capturing carbon. This is a picture on the lower left of an oak savanna in Minnesota, a really iconic oak ecosystem here in the Midwest in the US, where I'm based. The picture in the middle is a purple hair-streaked butterfly, which is native to Europe and is heavily reliant on oaks, and I love its Latin name, Quercus. So this little butterfly is leaning in really hard to loving oaks, and it's been named twice basically for that. So there are a lot of insects and animals that rely on oaks for their habitat and for their food. But humans also rely on oaks for cultural value. They are beautiful, iconic trees that pop up in folklore and in stories and histories throughout civilizations. They're the national tree of at least 18 countries, including the USA. You can see oak leaves popping up here on the flag of Mexico. And they're the state tree of 7 states and the District of Columbia, including the state tree of Illinois. They have great economic value. The wood is very sturdy, it's very water resistant, it's been used for shipbuilding for millennia. The bark of oak trees is used for tanning leather. And on the upper right, you can see some cows that are eating acorns falling out of that tree. That's a Quercus brandegii in Mexico. And acorns are a valuable food source for livestock, but they've also been an important food source for human civilizations over time. They provide timber and lumber for flooring and for construction, for building furniture, and possibly one of my favorite uses for oaks is in wine barrels, and even the bark of cork oak is used to make our corks go into the wine bottles. So really, there are a lot of reasons to love an oak tree. They're also just an amazingly diverse and beautiful group to work with and to just enjoy sort of horticulturally, ornamentally. These are 9 different species of oak tree of pictures that I took from the National Arboretum in France. And it just shows some of the amazing diversity that you can see in habit and form and leaf shape. And so ornamentally, they're very important for our landscaping, for our urban street trees, for our communities, for beautifying our neighborhoods. And they're just kind of a fun group of trees to work with generally. So why are we so interested in oaks at the Morton Arboretum? Well, the Arboretum is a large public garden, 1,700 acres in the western suburbs of Chicago. And we have a lot of people that are interested in oaks. In the lower left corner, you can see Andrew Hipp, who is our director of our herbarium and our plant systematist, who does a lot of research in our Center for Tree Science on the evolution and systematics of oaks. So we also have a population genetic lab studying genetic diversity of oaks. We have researchers conducting studies on arboricultural and best planting and care techniques for oaks in an urban forest. We have a nationally accredited oak collection. We're one of 20 institutions in the United States that are accredited by the American Public Gardens Association for our oaks. And we have around 100 taxa of oaks in our collections. And in the lower right, you can see Matt Lobdell, who is our curator, checking out one of our oak trees in our oak collection. The white oak, which is in the upper left corner, is the state tree of Illinois. It's also in our logo. And our oak collections and our oak habitats across the property at the Arboretum are split in half roughly into collections and into managed national areas. So we have hundreds of acres of actively managed oak woodland and oak savanna. And you can see one of our burn crew in the upper right who's doing an annual controlled burn of our habitat to ensure that we have healthy oak ecosystems. And as part of that, we also run the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, which is our urban conservation program, which has a strong focus on oaks. And early on in that program, we started examining the oak ecosystems in the Chicago region and identified that oaks in our area are seriously under threat. Oak species and oak-dominated ecosystems in the Chicago region are in decline. And through some analysis that our Chicago Region Trees Initiative conducted, we determined that at least 83% of our original oak ecosystems have been lost in the Chicago region. And that got us thinking, how serious is the risk of extinction for oaks at a global scale? Well, when you start to talk about extinction and assessing the risk of extinction, the red list is really where your head should be going. So the red list of threatened species is a platform managed by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And it is the gold standard for assessing the extinction risk of plant and animal and fungal species around the world. And it is a detailed, objective platform for assessing threats. This is what the web interface looks like. I would encourage everybody to go check it out. I have the website and my resources at the end of the presentation that I'll share with everyone. But check it out, look up your favorite plant species and see if it has been assessed for its risk of extinction. The way that the red list works is that it evaluates species through looking at various categories of data, demographic and ecological data, and evaluate species to place them into one of these categories. And it can range from being extinct, which is like obviously very bad, worst risk of extinction if you're already there, all the way up to least concern in the green color, which is, you know, no worry, no obvious imminent threat. The species is doing pretty well. You can also have a data deficient species where you gathered the information, as much information as you could, but you didn't have enough to actually classify it into one of these other threat categories. And then there's not evaluated, which is just one of actually very many species in the world that has never been examined for its extinction risk. And the way that it works is that we gather demographic and ecological data and compare it to various thresholds that would assign it to these different categories. And we look at things like population size, is it big or is it small? Population fragmentation. We look at range size, so how widely distributed the species is or if it's a very narrow endemic. We look at habitat quality and if that's getting better or worse. We look at what the different threats are, and we look at the level of human exploitation. So is it being selectively harvested, for example? So one of the criteria you could look at is a declining population. And if you, for example, went and looked at a species one year and found that there are a whole lot of individuals, and you went back just a few years later and there were only a handful of them, if you had a greater than 90% population size decline over just a couple of generations, that would qualify the species as critically endangered. So these are these thresholds that I was describing. So you can classify something as threatened based on declining population. You can look at the native range. So an extremely restricted, narrowly endemic species. For example, this is the distribution map, this little green splotch in the Florida Panhandle. That's Torreya taxifolia, one of the most threatened trees in the United States. It has incredibly restricted range, so qualifies as critically endangered. You could also just have very few individuals. So it may not necessarily be declining rapidly, but if you have fewer than, for example, 250 individuals in the wild, you would qualify as critically endangered. This is an example of one of those species. This is a magnolia that's native to China, Magnolia sinica. And we think there are only about 55 individuals of that species left in the world. So these are the thresholds that we compare our species to decide whether or not they're threatened. And there are a lot of threatened species out there that are pretty iconic that people recognize as being, oh yeah, that's a threatened species. Giant panda is a classic example. Hawksbill sea turtle, critically endangered. And in fact, the giant panda used to be endangered. It was actually downlisted to vulnerable in 2016 because of decades of very concerted conservation work by experts in China. So this species is an indicator that, you know, the red list can actually, you can actually get better on the red list. You can be downlisted from endangered to vulnerable, which the panda was. And so, you know, I think that there are a lot of iconic species out there that people recognize as, oh yes, that's an endangered species. But I think that there are a lot of species that might surprise you when you learn that they're threatened. Fraser fir is one of these examples. It's America's favorite Christmas tree. That's the national Christmas tree in the White House from a few years ago. And Fraser fir is native to the Appalachian region around North Carolina, and it is endangered because of an invasive insect, the woolly balsam woolly adelgid, that has been decimating populations there. And I think that can be kind of a surprise to people to realize that, you know, a tree that we, you know, cultivate heavily is actually very threatened in the wild. Ginkgo is another great example. You know, there are orders of magnitude, many more ginkgos growing in the world in cultivation than there are in the wild, and that is actually an endangered species in its native range and habitat in China. So we were going to use the red list to assess oaks, and we wanted to see what the situation was for oaks on the red list when we started this project in 2015. And the one thing we had to go on at that point was a publication that had been released in 2007. It was a report that evaluated only about 40% of the world's oak species at the time, and they found that 78 species were threatened with extinction. But the report, the data from the report was never actually submitted to the IUCN, to the Red List unit. So they were never reviewed by the IUCN, and they weren't published on the IUCN website. And also, Red List assessments expire after 10 years. And so we were coming up on the 10-year expiration of those assessments. And so they basically needed to be reevaluated from scratch. So when you actually looked at the IUCN website in 2015, when we got started, there were only 11 species of the 430 or so species in the world that had been assessed for the Red List, 4 of which were threatened. So we realized that there was a great need for this assessment and that we had a lot of work to do. So what did we do? Well, we actually didn't know how to red list when we started this project. So we had to train ourselves. And the Red List has a great online training platform. And it's a pretty sort of self-taught, self-explanatory process, but several of our staff members at the Morton Arboretum got trained up in how to become a Red Lister, a Red List assessor, and got certified. We then had to start to gather data and references. So we needed to get all of that ecological and demographic information. So we did that through floras and monographs and journal articles and collecting reports that gardens had shared with us, a lot of published literature, a lot of gray literature, a lot of sort of personal communications with experts. We also needed some partners, and Botanic Gardens Conservation International was a core partner of ours through this whole effort. They helped to lead the Global Tree Specialist Group, which is one of the IUCN's volunteer networks of experts that do red listing. And so we joined the Global Tree Specialist Group effort to assess trees and took on oaks under that umbrella. We had to recruit experts as well, because we certainly don't know all of the oaks of the world. So we hosted workshops, we did a lot of emailing, we did a lot of phone calling. Hundreds of people contributed to the assessments that we did throughout this project. We also had to develop a species checklist because there's no globally accepted or recognized treatment for Quercus. And there's a whole lot of debate and discussion taxonomically about how many species there are. So, you know, we had to be kind of pragmatic with that. We definitely relied on local experts to help us decide what the species checklist was for the different regions. And we focused regionally. So we started in the United States, where we had more connections, more experience, and did the red list of the US oaks first, and then moved into Mexico and Central America, and then Europe and Asia. And we just churned them out. We compiled, reviewed, and submitted assessments over the course of 5 years. And we ended up publishing 3 kind of landmark reports over that 5-year period. The Red List of U.S. Oaks was led by Diana Jerome in partnership with BGCI and the U.S. Forest Service, and that came out in 2017. We also were doing in parallel a conservation gap analysis of native U.S. oaks, which was led by Emily Beckman in partnership with Abby Meyer of BGCI US and also the Forest Service. And that was a publication that kind of went hand in hand with the Red List of U.S. Oaks, and it actually did a much deeper dive into the conservation activities that are currently underway. So where the Red List is pretty much focused on threats and is this thing going extinct or not, the gap analysis was kind of more of a good news story. It was a roadmap for action, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. And then just in December, we finally published the global Red List of Oaks, the Red List of Oaks 2020, which summarizes all of our results for the whole group across the entire world. And Christina Carrero led that publication for us. So what did we find? Well, our final checklist had 430 species of oak, and of those, we found that at least 112 species are threatened with extinction. And when I say threatened with extinction, I mean that they fall in the pie slice that is red, orange, or yellow. So critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. That's about a quarter of the species. But if you take into account that gray slice of pie, which is data deficient, the actual number of threatened species is probably about a third of the world's oak species, because data deficient species are likely rare. We don't have a lot of information about them, so they're generally not very widespread. And we suspect that a lot of the data deficient species will also end up in the threatened categories once we actually get enough information about them. So that was our sort of first somewhat concerning result, is that there are definitely a lot of threatened oak species in the world. So what does the pattern of oak diversity look like? Well, the 430 species are found in 90 countries in the world, and this is a heat map of species richness for oak diversity, where the darker red and purple colors are more species. Mexico is the global center of oak diversity with 164 native species, followed by China with 117, and the United States. We have 91 native oaks in the US. The threatened species richness patterns actually pretty much follow the first map that I showed. So this is a similar map, similar heat map, but this just has the critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable species shown. And China actually leads the world in threatened oak species with 36, followed by Mexico with 32. Then Vietnam, a relatively small country, has 20 threatened native species, and the United States, we have 16. This is another way of looking at that information. This shows the threat categories by region. So United States and Canada, Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean, Europe and North Africa and Asia. And the sizes of the pie are roughly proportional to the number of native species. And what I'd like to point out here, first of all, take a look at the slices of pie that are red, orange, yellow, and also that sort of pale light green, which is near threatened. These are the threatened categories, the ones that we're most concerned about. And as you can see, Mexico and Central America and Asia have a higher proportion of threatened species. But also take a look at the data deficient slice, the gray slice of pie. And in that situation, you see that Mexico and Central America and Asia have by far the most data deficient species. There are actually quite a few more in North Africa and in Southern Europe, but in terms of number of species, it's not as many because there are many fewer species there. So what are the threats to oaks globally? Well, this is a graph that shows what the most common threats to species, the oak species are, and the blue bars are the species that are classified as threatened. The red bars are the not, or sorry, other way around. Blue is not threatened species, the red are the threatened species. And when we compile these red list assessments, the IUCN provides a sort of standard designation or classification for threats, which is a really helpful way to look sort of systematically at what the threats are for species. So you can break it down by sort of major threat class. Agriculture and aquaculture, well, not so much aquaculture, it's just lumped in with that category, but essentially agriculture, it's land clearing for crops that is causing the biggest threats to both threatened and non-threatened species. Biological resource use with relation to oaks is mostly the harvesting of the oaks themselves for timber, for charcoal, for other like logging purposes. Then there's, residential and commercial development. Natural system modifications with oaks is mostly fire or fire suppression. Climate change and severe weather, and then invasive and other problematic species, genes, and diseases is a problem. So these are the trends at a global scale, but if you look at it in a little more granular detail, what we find is that the worst threats in Asia, Europe, Mexico, and Central America are the land clearing for agriculture. But interestingly, the worst threat in the United States to our threatened species is invasive and other problematic species, genes, and diseases. So that category includes invasive pests and diseases, but it also can include our native pests and diseases, as well as issues like introgression or hybridization with other co-occurring species of oaks. So that's kind of an interesting threat classification there, but I just wanted to point this out because the challenges facing these oaks is not universal, right? You have to take each one case by case and region by region. So that was the bad news. What can we do to save oaks? Well, what we found through the course of our research and compiling these reports and conducting these gap analyses is that we really need to work together. This is a big problem. It's a really big challenge. No one person or institution can really tackle it alone. We need to get more people involved from all sectors of society. So it's not just botanic gardens. It's not just the conservation NGOs. It's not just the protected areas and the government agencies. We need business and industry. We need private citizens. We need as many different types of partners in this effort as we can. And we need to build conservation capacity in the global centers of diversity for oak. We saw, for example, in the data that there was a huge amount of data deficiency for species in Mexico and in Southeast Asia and China. So those are areas where we really need to focus some effort. So what are we doing about it? Well, one new solution that we are really excited about is the establishment of global conservation consortia. And this is a program that's led by Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which is a big conservation NGO, a partner organization of botanic gardens from around the world dedicated to preventing plant extinctions. And the goal of the Global Conservation Consortia is to mobilize a coordinated network of institutions and experts to collaboratively develop and implement comprehensive conservation strategies for priority threatened tree groups. Well, plant groups. Right now it's mostly trees. And these are the consortia that have been established so far. They're taxonomically focused. So there's a consortium for maples, Acer, for cycads, for dipterocarps, for magnolias, for oaks, and for rhododendrons. And there's a few more in the pipeline that are being created. And these are all tree groups mostly, but these are all plant groups that are difficult to propagate for various reasons. They're highly threatened, and they are global in distribution, or at least cover many, many countries. And so they require this globally coordinated approach for conservation. And each taxonomically focused consortium aims to establish and foster a global network of experts that can answer questions and can really tackle these big challenges for that particular plant group. Identify and prioritize species of greatest conservation concern. So the goal is to have red list assessments for all of the species in these groups. And luckily, we've actually kind of checked that task off the list for now for the oaks. We want to develop coordinated ex situ collections of high conservation value. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, so I'll define that for you. The consortia undertake and facilitate applied research in their group of focus. They ensure that threatened species are conserved in the wild. They build capacity of those in-country partners in the global centers of diversity for that particular plant group. They increase public awareness and engagement around the importance of conservation of those plants, and they raise funding to scale up conservation actions to tackle these global challenges. So what I want to do now is just tell you about a few of the projects that we have underway in a few of these key themes or areas of work that we're doing for the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak. So the first conservation solution is to develop coordinated ex situ collections of high conservation value. And I want to back up for a second and actually define what is an ex situ collection. An ex situ collection is a repository of plant material that is held outside of the species' natural habitat or natural range. And that can be a living collection. So for example, this is the oak collection at the Morton Arboretum. So our curated, documented collection of living trees. Or an ex situ collection could be something like a seed bank or a tissue culture or cryopreserved collections. This is an image of our National Seed Bank in Fort Collins, Colorado. And it's essentially like an airplane hangar sized building that is a giant freezer. And you just pack a lot of seeds in there, they get dried and they get chilled, and you can preserve them long term as seeds. Why would we want to do this? Why conserve threatened plants in ex situ collections? Well, if it's a living collection, you can conduct research on them. You can see how they grow, how they adapt. You can see how they handle new incoming pests and diseases or extreme weather events. You can do selective breeding, whether that's for conservation purposes or to create new ornamental and horticultural varieties. You can use those living collections to generate new plant material that you can use for restoration projects, so reinforcing the populations in the wild. And you can use the living collections to educate the community and your visitors about the importance of plants and why and how they're threatened and what they can do to help. But probably the most important reason to have ex situ collections is as an insurance policy against extinction. So for these rare plant species where they're sort of hovering on the brink in the wild, we can have a sort of a stopgap against extinction if we conserve as much as possible of the genetic diversity of the wild plants in these ex situ collections. So this is a pretty important tool for conservation, especially for threatened plants. And the more genetic diversity that you have in your ex situ collections, the higher the conservation value, the better of an insurance policy it is, because you're preserving all of that potential adaptive capacity in that species. And seed banks are the most effective ex situ collections of high conservation value. That's just because they're very effective and efficient. You can pack a whole lot of seeds, a lot of genetic diversity into a tiny little envelope like the one that this man is holding. And so they're great if it works, but some plants are exceptional. And we use the term exceptional to define plants that produce seeds that cannot be seed banked. So it may be that they have no or low or sporadic seed production, so they're just not very good seed producers. The seeds might be recalcitrant, which means that they don't tolerate the drying step that is necessary to put a seed into a seed bank long term. Or the seeds don't tolerate the freezing step of a seed bank, or they're short-lived once you freeze them, and that sort of defeats the purpose if you can't get a living plant out the other end of it. And importantly, all of the taxonomic groups that have been established for these global conservation consortia, all of those plants of focus are exceptional. So that includes oaks, magnolias, cycads. None of those plant groups can be seed banked. So we do not have this tool at our disposal for conservation. So what is the conservation value of our oak collections, our ex situ collections? Well, we know that the living ex situ collections are the ones that are especially important as a conservation tool because they can't be seed banked because they're exceptional. So as part of the gap analysis that I told you about, this publication that we put out in 2019, as part of the research for that project, we conducted a survey of living collections of all native US oak species in 2017. And this is what we found. The number of plants per oak species in ex situ collections by provenance type is shown on this graph. So species along the x-axis, number of individuals in living collections is on the y-axis. And provenance type is basically what we use in botanic gardens to explain where the material came from. So the provenance type is usually one of 3 different classifications. So the green color here is wild, which means that the plant that's growing in the botanic garden collection was collected as a seed in the wild, and we know where it came from. We know the population that we got it from. Ideally, we know exactly the GPS coordinates of where it came from. And that's important because it tells us what that population is. It means that there could be some important local adaptation to that population. And so it's really important to know where your plants came from. Also, who collected it, when it was collected, that sort of information. That's all in the provenance data. The orange colors on the graphs are unknown, which means that there's a plant growing in a collection. We know what it is, we can identify it, but we don't know where it actually came from. And you'd be surprised at how many species, how many plants are growing in our botanical collections, especially in older gardens. And we don't know where they came from. And then the blue bar is horticultural, which means that it was either purchased from a nursery or provided from another garden. So it's of horticultural origin. And then the red bars over the species here are the species of conservation concern. And for the gap analysis, when we did this assessment, we defined species of conservation concern as including all of the IUCN Red List threatened species, so critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable, as well as our near threatened species, our data deficient species. And then we added in a couple other factors like susceptibility to climate change and representation in ex situ collections. As a way of determining if some other species, if we added a few more species to our list of species of conservation concern. And essentially what you can see on this graph is that the more threatened or rare an oak species is, the less likely it is to have a lot of individuals in its living collection. So you see a lot more of the red lines, the species of concern, down at the far end of this graph where there's just a handful of individuals in our living collections. So from our 2017 data, of those 28 US species of concern, 8 of them were in 5 or fewer botanical collections. 5 species were only held in European collections, which means we didn't have any of that germplasm in country, in the United States, where these species are actually growing in the wild. 8 species were represented by 10 or fewer individual plants. 6 species were represented by 5 or fewer plants of known wild origin. And 1 species was not in any collection at all, anywhere in the world, and that's Quercus tardifolia. So this is really concerning because these are species that are rare, they're already of conservation concern, and we don't have them backed up in any of our collections. If they disappeared in the wild, that's it, they're gone. So we decided to do something about it. And so this is a little case study of a species we've been working on at the Morton Arboretum. It's the Georgia oak, Quercus georgiana. It's distributed in Mississippi and Georgia, and historically was in North Carolina and South Carolina, but we think that those populations have been extirpated. The habitat is shallow soil islands on isolated granite outcrops in the Piedmont Plateau region, and you can see a couple pictures of it there growing in the wild. And it's threatened by a variety of things: introgression, so hybridization with other red oak species that co-occur in the area, because oaks love to hybridize, And there's a lot of hybrids of this species, and we're finding fewer and fewer sort of quote unquote pure Quercus georgiana. There are very small, non-viable population size, so just little pockets of individuals scattered about. Drought and climate change are a challenge because they're on these really thin soils, basically on just rocks. And soil compaction and trampling from recreation is a challenge. So all of these things combined mean that Georgia oak is endangered. And it's one of the species we were really interested in improving the ex situ collections for. So we did a population scouting and seed collecting trip that was funded through a grant by the American Public Gardens Association and U.S. Forest Service Tree Gene Conservation Partnership, which is a wonderful program that APGA offers that targets exceptional trees and building up these ex situ collections for exceptional trees. So we had a number of partners, the Donald D. Davis Arboretum, the Huntington Library and Gardens, Atlanta and Chicago Botanic Garden, a bunch of partners. We ran a couple of collecting trips over the course of 2 years and collected herbarium specimens, collected acorns, and we really wanted to focus these trips on filling gaps. So making sure that the individuals that we were collecting were from populations that had never before been represented in ex situ collections. And this is what the data from our gap analysis helped inform. So this is one of the maps that we produced in that conservation gap analysis publication. What you're looking at here, any of the little black or white triangles is a population of a known documented population of Georgia oak in the wild. The little white circles are county centroids where the species had been reported in the past, but we didn't have any more detail than just like a sort of report that this thing existed in that county. And so it's a very sort of probably less reliable occurrence where you have like the little circles. So you can almost ignore those. The triangles are much more reliable in terms of where this distribution really is. So the black triangles are populations from which we have a tree or trees growing in ex situ collections. So that's the population of origin of where we have current collections. And so what we wanted to do for our collecting trip was specifically cover ground that had not been collected before so that we could really maximize the genetic and ecological diversity of our living collections. So this map on the left is what the situation looked like in 2017. The map on the right is after we did our collecting trip that was supported by the Public Gardens Association and the Forest Service. And the bright green triangles here are the new populations that we were able to collect from. And to gather new germplasm from to improve the conservation value of the current collections. So the outcomes for Georgia oak were that we had 8 new populations conserved in living collections, so new individuals, that were represented by hundreds of additional plants. And if you think back to the graph I showed before, some of these poorly represented species were represented by just 5 or 10 individuals. So now we have hundreds of plants growing. We, on site at the Morton Arboretum, are creating conservation groves. So this little diagram on the lower left is the future planting arrangement for 200 trees that we're going to put into our Quercus collection that is a conservation grove. So lots of individuals from across the geographic range of Georgia oak. And we're going to do that for a few different oak species. We have the germplasm collected. It's just growing up now as seedlings. Not quite ready to be planted out yet. We also were able to share acorns with other gardens, including new gardens that did not have Georgia oak in their collections before, which is great because it's sort of spreading the risk that if any of these plants were to die or if the gardens were to close, that we have the genetic diversity backed up in other living collections. So now what we want to do is scale this up. We want to do a lot more collecting through the consortium and in partnership with the APGA Plant Collections Network and the Oak Multi-Site Network, all of those nationally accredited collections, partner together to do more collecting get those acorns out to more sites. For example, Forest Service seed orchards and state managed lands, even private landowners could participate in this effort to have these really high conservation value ex situ collections. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that we're replicating this ex situ data gathering and the analysis of the data and then the coordination of the collections outside of the US, especially in the global centers of oak diversity, because we need these ex situ collections growing in the country of origin, where we have all of these really rich species and center of diversity, but where we also have a lot of threat. So the next project I'm going to tell you about is under the consortium goal of undertaking and facilitating applied research. And the project that we've been working on is to conduct research to inform and improve the genetic conservation of ex situ living collections. So what I told you about before with the Georgia Oak Project, we sort of assumed that by collecting lots of individuals from across the geographic range and targeting a lot of the different ecological zones and habitat types, that we would be maximizing genetic coverage. But we didn't really know that for sure. So we've actually been testing that in our population genetics lab at the Morton Arboretum in partnership with a bunch of other gardens and government agencies. There's a long list of partners on this. This is an ongoing project. It's actually two different big grants that we received through the Institute of Museum and Library Services to improve the genetic conservation value of our living collections. And essentially what we're trying to do is conduct a range of population genetic studies to understand what the patterns and the levels of genetic diversity are for rare species in the wild. And then we're comparing that to the rates of genetic diversity that we capture in our living collections. So we're actually testing these theories of have we done a good job or not with these living collections. So this is one of the publications that came out last year, led by Howard Griffith and Montgomery Botanical Center, called Toward the Meta Collection, Coordinating Conservation Collections to Safeguard Plant Diversity. And this is a great publication. It's very user-friendly and approachable about basically how do you make sure that you have living collections of high conservation value. And what we found was that no one garden or collection can or should hold all of the plants in a conservation collection. Really, they should be spread out across lots of different gardens. So it should be a coordinated meta collection. This idea that you have lots of collections that are managed in a very systematic and coordinated way so that you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, essentially. We also found that to ensure high conservation value, living collections should capture the maximum amount of wild genetic diversity, but you should stop before you reach the point of diminishing returns where resources are wasted. And that's really important because a lot of the trees that we're talking about in these living collections and these meta collections are really big. They're big, long-lived trees, and they can take up a ton of space. And so you want to make sure that you are capturing a lot of wild genetic diversity, but that you don't have a ton of duplication and sort of unnecessary effort into managing tons and tons of trees that take up time and space and resources, and they have to be cared for. So this concept of diminishing returns, we published in another paper led by Sean Hoban's group. And I think it illustrates it really well here, this idea of diminishing returns and genetic diversity capture of living collections. And what this graph is basically showing you, there are 5 different genera represented here. So each species in the genus is color-coded similarly. So there's magnolias in green, there's palms, there's hibiscus, and there's oaks. The oaks are in blue. And what this basically shows is that the number of plants is on the x-axis. So, and then the percentage of genetic variation that is captured by that living collection, by those numbers of plants, is shown on the y-axis. And in general, we're aiming to capture about 95% of genetic diversity, 95% of alleles. And what you can see is that for like some of the magnolias and the hibiscus, you only need about 50 plants before you get up above 95% genetic capture. That's the dashed line across the middle of the graph. But where you start to plateau at the top is that point of diminishing returns. So you don't really need to collect many more. You don't need to have many more than 50 or 100 individuals in your collections before you've pretty much got all the genetic diversity that you need captured, and you're starting to just waste space at that point. And the interesting thing about this study was that we found that actually there can be a huge range. So you know, for this one magnolia, you can get about 95% of genetic diversity with just about 20 plants. But for one of the cycads, the Zamia decumbens, you need almost up to 100 plants to capture the same amount of genetic diversity. So this is an interesting ongoing study that we continue to add data sets to. And then a last research project I'll tell you about is an exciting one that we've just started, where we're looking at the species boundaries and hybridization in the Quercus tardifolia species complex. And if you'll recall, Quercus tardifolia was the one species that was not in any living collections in our 2017 ex situ survey. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a really tricky species. So this is Quercus tardifolia, at least we think that's what Quercus tardifolia is on the left. It's a data deficient species, meaning that we haven't been able to really assess it because it's still so confusing about what it really is. There's a lot of other red oaks in the region where it grows, which is in Southwest Texas, a very, very narrow area around the Chisos Mountains in Southwest Texas. There's a lot of hybridization with some of these other species that I've shown here. So there's data deficient species and some critically endangered species in that region. And what we are going to do in partnership with the US Botanic Garden and BGCI and our partners Adam Black and Wes Knapp is try to figure out, is Quercus tardifolia really a species? And if it is a species, does it still exist? The last trees that we know of that were pretty confidently tardifolia-esque died about 15 or 20 years ago. So we're going to conduct field expeditions to find populations of this species. We're going to get leaf samples from as many individuals as we can and conduct next generation sequencing to evaluate on all of these different entities to try to figure out where one species starts and where another one begins, and how much hybridization is happening and what the entities really are in that really diverse and oak-rich region of Texas. And we're going to collect herbarium specimens, which will help us examine the range of morphological traits that we can then compare to the genetic data. So these are just some examples of some of the applied research that we're doing through the consortium. The last conservation solution I'm going to talk about is the importance of building capacity of in-country partners in those global centers of diversity for the oak group. And there really is a need for capacity building. This is a map of where all of the world's 3,000 or so botanic gardens are. And this map was produced by Abby Meyer and Julie Ho at the Huntington and BGCI. And it's really useful, I think. It basically overlays all of the world's botanic gardens on the 36 global biodiversity hotspots. And a biodiversity hotspot is actually a defined entity by Biodiversity International and the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, CEPF. And to be a biodiversity hotspot, a particular region or habitat needs to have at least 1,500 endemic vascular plant species, so plant species that live there and nowhere else in the world. And it needs to have had at least 70% habitat loss. So essentially they're areas of great diversity, but also great threat. And the different biodiversity hotspots are colored in this sort of peachy orange color, and the gardens are laid on top of it. And gardens outside, well outside of biodiversity hotspots, are coded green. The ones that are close to a hotspot are color-coded yellow, and the ones in the hotspot are red. And I just want to draw your attention to our centers of diversity for oak, which is the Mexico and the southern United States, and then Southeast Asia and southern China, and compare how gappy it is there, like the lack of botanic gardens there compared to Europe, for example, or the northeastern United States. So we have a problem in that we have a whole lot of our world's botanical institutions not where a lot of our botanical diversity is. And this is just a reminder of our oak diversity hotspots. They basically completely overlap with, global diversity hotspots. So what are we doing? The consortium has a lot of different approaches to building capacity in these centers of diversity, but probably first and foremost is to work with local communities and partners in these centers of diversity. It's so important to adopt a participatory conservation planning approach. This is one of the projects that our tree conservation ecologist, Sylvia Alvarez-Clare, leads in Baja California Sur in Mexico. And this is an oak conservation project, and we have all of these wonderful local partners. They're researchers, her graduate student is there, and these are also ranchers and farmers that rely on a threatened oak species in the region for shade and for food for their livestock. The livestock eat the acorns, and it's a really important, economic and sort of ecological species in the area. And we are working together with, really important input and feedback and participation with these local farmers to try to figure out what the real limitations to this threatened species is and what we can do to make it, to reinforce it and to sort of alleviate those threats. We support plant exploration, field survey, and taxonomic work in understudied regions. This is a field trip that we supported in Myanmar this was a month-long collecting trip that took place really in a remote region of Myanmar where there are almost no sort of documented field expeditions before for sort of, scientifically described species. Obviously, there's a lot of local botanical knowledge, but, we need to sort of capture that so that we can ensure that we're conserving it and protecting it and celebrating that. We provide training in plant identification, field survey techniques, and seed collecting. This is a Fagaceae plant identification course that we led in Laos recently and it's not just botanic gardens, it's nature reserve staff, it's even local community members and private landowners. And in a lot of places, there's a lot of community managed lands, and working with those local community members that actually have land that they can support and conserve on their own is really important to build that training in plant identification. And ultimately, we support local livelihoods. We help establish native tree nurseries. We build infrastructure like greenhouses. And we're working to restore threatened plants in the wild. This is Sylvia on the right here planting that endangered Quercus brandegii in Baja California Sur. And we have, so far her program, and she has planted thousands of seedlings in research plots and in herbivore exclosure areas and out just sort of in the habitat to figure out, some of them are research plants, why is the species not regenerating, but some of it is also just restoration work, getting these plants back into the wild. And really our goal is to see this species go away the way of the giant panda, where we ultimately will be hopefully downlisting it over time because it's doing better and we've alleviated threats and restored populations in the wild. So what are some take-home points? Oaks are ecologically, economically, and culturally important trees across the Northern Hemisphere. The IUCN Red List is the global standard for assessing extinction risk of plant and animal species, and 1/3 of the world's oak species are threatened with extinction, including 16 threatened species right here in the US. The global centers of oak diversity are Mexico, China, the United States, and Southeast Asia. Oak acorns cannot be seed banked, and so living collections of high conservation value are a crucial tool to preventing extinctions. And conservation efforts are underway through global collaborations, such as the ones I described through the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak, but we really need more help. So what can you do? Join us. join the consortium. I'm providing here the contact information of Amy Byrne, who is our GCCO coordinator. You can email Amy if you want more information, and you can also email her if you want to get connected to one of the other consortia as well. So, you know, oaks are awesome. I love them, but if maples are your thing, that's okay. You know, come our way. We'll send you to the right people so that you can join the ACER consortium. Oh, and I'm supposed to remind everyone that if you have questions at this point, please pop them in the Q&A box because I'm wrapping up. Also, get to know your local oak species, especially the rare ones. That's really important. If we have a really connected force of interested people around the country, then, you know, I think that we are on the right way to conserving these rare oaks. You could join the International Oak Society as well. That's a plant professional society and hobbyist society as well. There's all types of people in the International Oak Society, and they've just started a conservation grant. So that's another great place to find fellow Quercophiles. Share what you know with others. Share the story of oaks. Tell your friends and neighbors and your colleagues and your policymakers, people who manage the natural areas in your area, that oaks are really important to the local ecosystems and the green infrastructure in your neighborhood as well. Volunteer with your local botanic garden or arboretum or nature reserve and help monitor and maintain healthy oak habitat. Support your local botanic garden. Even the events or shopping in the gift shop or they're taking their classes, all of that supports their mission-driven conservation programs. Ask about native oak species at your local nursery, especially if you're in the landscaping business. You know, put pressure on your providers that you want locally sourced native oak species for your plantings, and plant an oak. And I wanted to say thank you as well to all of our generous supporters that have helped launch and make the GCCO possible. And especially our partners at BGCI, and also through the Plant Collections Network of the American Public Garden Association here in the US. Here is our list of resources. There's a lot. I won't go through them all. I think this is going to be made available afterwards, but check these publications or these websites out, and feel free to reach out to me or to Amy if you have any questions about any of this. And I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and we do have many questions. Can you talk a little bit about planting oaks into forests to replace falling or aging trees? Do they need full sun, or how can you get them established under the canopy of existing trees?
That is a great question. That's actually a question that we have been doing a lot of research on through our forest ecology research group at the Morton Arboretum. Christy Rawlinson and Megan Midgley have been are two of our scientists in our Center for Tree Science, and they've been doing a lot of research on oak ecosystems, mostly in like the Midwest. But certainly we know that shade is a problem for a lot of our native oak species, and there are a lot of maples encroaching. A lack of shade can be a big problem. It's a little more nuanced than just clear the canopy, which is tricky, and I think not what everybody wants to hear. But I would direct people interested in like oak habitat maintenance to check out the publications through our Center for Tree Science, so Christy Rawlinson and Megan Midgley's work. Also look at our Chicago Region Trees Initiative website. I should probably add that to the resources page. But CRTI has an oak ecosystem recovery program. And one of the big goals that they're working on is figuring out what the best management approaches are to oak forests and oak dominated woodlands. Mostly sort of with a Midwest focus, because remember that these are going to be very regional issues and challenges, and they'll have sort of regional solutions as well. But if you're in the Midwest, I would direct people to the Chicago Region Trees Initiative Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan.
Okay. How is a generation defined? Is it based on a tree lifetime or the lifetime to reproduce a tree of the same maturity?
Great question. So technically, for the IUCN, the definition of a generation time is the average age that it's essentially like, what is the age that the most individuals that are coming up, the average age of their parents. It's way easier to define generation time for penguins than it is for trees, especially for oaks. So with oaks, we have, you could have a white oak that starts to produce acorns after 15 or 20 years and then continues producing acorns for 300 years. For the purposes of the red list, we generally used about 30 years as the generation time for our oaks. But that ranged a little bit, and sometimes it was longer and sometimes it was shorter. What we've often done sort of as a pragmatic solution to the generation time question is said, sort of for a species, when is sort of the like peak reproductive age? So it's probably 30, 40 years for many of our oak species. It's not the age of first reproduction. It's more like the age at peak reproduction. That's such a good question, and one that we wrestle with all the time. I'd love to hear someone else's input on that.
Great. Where can landscape professionals source species to increase diversity?
Great question. Also going to be very regionally specific. I would actually suggest that that landscapers reach out to their local botanic garden and ask for suggestions of where to get reliably and sustainably sourced material. Tim Boland last week mentioned a couple of good suppliers in his presentation. In the Midwest, we have Possibility Place. There are a couple at the sort of wholesale level. I'm kind of less familiar with them. The Chicago Region Trees Initiative in the Midwest probably also has recommendations for where to source native plants, but I would say consult your local garden and see if they have suggestions for where to shop.
Okay, we have a couple of climate change related questions. Are there considerations for assisted migration in certain oak species?
Great question. So the big dilemma around assisted migration is the trade-off, or the sort of balance between, is it better to keep populations only breeding within the same population because you might have local adaptive variation there, so the species have adapted to that specific habitat, and you don't want to bring in germplasm from somewhere else that would take away from that or dilute that local adaptation. The flip side of the argument is, if you have incredibly rare or isolated populations and you have really small or shallow gene pools, you might be wanting to maximize the amount of gene flow that you have. So you sort of say, well, yeah, it might be locally adapted, but it's so inbred already and the population size is so small that there's actually more benefit in bringing in genetic diversity from these other populations, and at the risk of potentially diluting that local adaptation. I think we don't know we certainly don't know for all oak species. I don't even know that we know for a few oak species which one is better. I think the general consensus, or at least like what I lean more towards, is that more genetic diversity is good. And so you do want, I don't think you want to be like, breeding a population of, let's say, bur oak from Canada with a bur oak from northern Texas. But where you have rare populations, there's usually not a ton of really localized adaptation anyway, because they're pretty isolated distributions in the first place. So for most of our really rare species, we think, or, you know, and I think that the general consensus is that it's probably better to just let everything breed together to ensure that you have the most genetic diversity captured, because you're really at a risk of like a crashing sort of gene pool and inbreeding depression with these really rare populations in terms of assisted migration. And if you're, you know, trying to relocate things to another area, which populations do you use? But science goes on and we continue to test that. And that's a big question and something that we'd like to use our gardens actually to, and these meta collections to test further and see how populations from different provenances, from different locations do when you relocate them a couple 100 miles north, for example.
Interesting. Climate change and fluctuating rain availability has caused white oak deaths in the mid-Atlantic region. Are there similar problems going on across the country with oaks?
Yes. Yes, I would say that's true. I mean, so climate change is a tricky one. Like if you look at the Morton Arboretum and like the state of Illinois, we're predicted to feel more like sort of Texas and Louisiana by the end of the century, which is pretty terrifying considering, you know, how soon that actually is. The oaks we're planting today will be alive at the end of this century. Oaks live for a long time. They'll outlive me. So, so thinking about climate change is important, but I think this question is interesting because climate change is one issue, but just extreme weather is a bigger issue. So even if the average climate is sort of, you know, a slowly changing, slowly evolving thing, if we have extreme drought, extreme rain, like flooding and rain, extreme cold, you know, the polar vortexes that we've been having, that sort of extreme weather is probably a bigger limiting factor to, you know, certainly for our living collections, like wiping out a collection, but also just for rare species that are on the edge of their distribution or their sort of tolerance range. It's extreme weather that can actually eliminate a whole population, not so much just the average climate change. So both of those things are big issues and big concerns. And yes, whether it's wetter or drier, that can all, they can all have different impacts on different species.
Okay, that's good to know. We have a few folks who would be interested in planting some of the endangered oak species, and they have some land. Can you talk a little bit about what would be required and how they would go about volunteering some of their space?
Great. Well, I would say email us first of all, and we can talk to you more about the consortium. We are in the process of updating, well, actually creating in the first place, a sort of official onboarding process. So a website and an agreement that participants will sign. Essentially what we're looking for when we want to plant these ex situ collections of high conservation value is a sort of commitment to longevity, a certain amount of reliability that collection will be there in 10, 20, 30 years. We also want to make the material available so that, you know, researchers and conservationists are able to either study it or obtain acorns and germplasm off of it in the future so that we can do reintroduction projects, for example, and try to reinforce in the wild. And a certain amount of sort of monitoring and a little bit of care. You know, we want to make sure that these plants survive. So they, you know, we do want to ensure that the plants establish well, that they're cared for, and that they're tracked too in terms of the data. We want to know where exactly it is, you know, how it's growing, when it becomes reproductive. those are the sort of important features of these meta collections. And if something's going to be a part of our meta collection, that's the type of information and the kind of standards that we want to set for it. But email us and we will share more information. We're developing content for like webinars for how to be a meta collection and how to join us. And we're really ramping up. So we'd love to have more partners.
And a follow-up question, what sort of conditions would a desirable site already have some, say, red and white oaks, or not have any oaks at all?
I don't think that matters. That's a good question. I don't think it matters.
Okay.
You could have oaks, you could not have oaks.
Okay. And roughly how much land would be required for these collections?
I mean, that's another really good question. It depends on the species. You know, some of our threatened oaks are huge trees. Some of them are really tiny. You know, if we have listeners that are in the Southwest, they know that there are species down there of oak that don't get more than sort of 5 or 6 feet tall. So it depends a lot on the species. It also depends a bit on sort of how you care for it. So I showed that image of how we're going to plant a conservation grove at the Morton, which is trees on a 22-foot, a sort of 22-foot plot apart. But you know, I think even just half an acre would be sufficient to grow a good number of trees, and that would be, you know, important. That would be valuable. I mean, when we're talking about ex situ collections where there's only like 10 trees in existence in our ex situ collections, it doesn't take a lot of land to like double that number, you know. So I would say on the order of an acre or 2 would be a great contribution to the cause.
Excellent. Well,
more is better.
All right, very good. What tissue type, leaves, stems, roots, etc., are sampled to determine plant DNA?
Great question. Technically, any of them would give you the same answer. In terms of every cell, and with very few exceptions, almost every cell in a plant has the same sort of DNA record. What we actually do in practice is we try to gather leaves of trees that are still pretty young, so pretty fully expanded leaves, but early in the season, so spring leaves. That is when they are sort of fresh and they haven't started to really like toughen up over the course of the season. And that is where we have our best success with essentially you grind them up and treat them with some chemicals and you extract the DNA from them. And, you know, fairly young fresh leaves are the easiest material to use. Bark and acorns and roots have various challenges. There's physical challenges with actually being able to grind them up. You also have a lot of like other organisms living, like in roots, for example, you've got whole microflora and fauna living in and on your roots, which makes it really hard to figure out what DNA you're looking at. So we use young leaves.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about, does the Morton Arboretum or any of your other collaborators give out free oak saplings as part of encouraging it for homeowner use and to spread the oaks around?
We do. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of gardens do. The Morton Arboretum usually does Arbor Day activities. This year might be a little weird. Last year was a little weird because of coronavirus. But we love Arbor Day. That's our big tree planting holiday. It's the last Friday in April. And what we would often do is have tree giveaways. We do them on site. We'll do them at satellite locations around the city. And we usually we'll give out ornamental trees from nurseries, but we'll often give out, locally sourced native plants as well. And we always have an oak to give away, a little seedling. So I would suggest Googling or looking up Arbor Day celebrations in your area. Usually springtime. If you're in Florida, I think it's like way earlier in the year. It's random times. Other countries have Arbor Day celebrations at other times of year as well. But in the US, usually it's sometime in April. Look up your Arbor Day local Arbor Day celebrations or events, and often you will find gardens or nature reserves or conservation NGOs that are giving away seedlings or small plants that are part of that celebration.
Excellent. Have lessons been learned from the broad loss of elms and chestnuts that can be applied to protecting oaks?
Yes, many, and ash as well. So on the urban front, the biggest take-home point is plant a diversity of urban trees. I'm not even 100%, I'm not even totally against non-native trees. The right tree in the right place, even if it's a non-native, can still be valuable, can still provide, some level of habitat, and can still be healthy, good green infrastructure. But plant a diversity of trees. Native is usually better. And we always say, if you love what's growing in your neighbor's front yard, plant something different. Don't if you see a ton of something in your neighborhood, try to find a tree to plant that is not what you're seeing. That's not very common. And that's also what some of these native plant nurseries are really good at finding, is sort of the unusual, local native plant. So yes, planting a diversity of urban trees is so important. There are huge pushes right now with all the tree planting initiatives that are going on to improve the urban canopy. We have the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, which the Morton Arboretum leads. It has a really big tree canopy goal for Chicago, which is increasing our canopy by 3 or 4% over what it currently is. And it basically involves planting 22 million trees over the next 5 years. And it needs to be more diverse than it is. Many gardens in many cities will do a tree inventory and take a look at what their percentages are. And you want to have a certain amount of differences in terms of the number of families represented, and then also the number of genera represented and the number of species represented. So the more diverse you can plant, the better. And then you don't have that situation where you have an entire block and all it had was elms on it and they all died, so they lost all of their trees. And so instead ash were planted, and then all the ash died, and now that poor block has no trees again. And it's dangerous because the trees break and fall and crush cars and can crush people, and it's expensive to remove them. And you lose that habitat, and your housing values go down, and your heating and cooling costs go up. And so having a healthy urban canopy is so important, and diversity is really key to that. But also early detection and monitoring for new invasive pests and diseases. And actually botanic gardens are really great agents for that, because we very closely monitor a big selection of different plants that we grow in our collections. And so botanic gardens can be a really great sort of early detection system for new pests and diseases coming in.
Very good. Do you have a list of the 16 threatened oaks in the United States, or a list of specific threatened oaks by region in the country that you could share with us? And if so, if you can send it to me, I'll be able to distribute it when I distribute the link to the recording for this presentation.
Yes. All of that is on my resources slide. And I don't know if right now my picture is covering the resources slide. It might be on your screen, but the red list of US oaks, which you can find on the Morton Arboretum's website, is the PDF. It's a publication. It has the full list of all of our threatened species, as well as the near threatened and the data deficient. So you can see all of our species of concern. And then the conservation gap analysis of native US oaks, which is the other green covered publication that I showed, has all of that information as well. And it has for each of the species of concern, it has a separate species profile. And it goes into really deep information for each of those 28 species of conservation concern in the US. So that includes those 16 threatened species, plus the data deficient ones and the near threatened ones, and the ones that are poorly represented in ex situ collections, and ones that we think are more susceptible to climate change. So it's the threatened ones and more. We did this deep dive, and so there's a species profile for each one, and those are in the publication, and you can also get those species profiles individually as PDFs on the Morton Arboretum's Global Tree Conservation Program webpage. But I have the link to that in my resources, but just Google conservation gap analysis of native US oaks, and you should get that PDF, and it's like 250 pages long. So it has all the information I'm thinking that you could possibly want for our native US oaks that are under threat. And it includes the threats, it includes the conservation actions that are currently underway, our conservation recommendations of what needs to happen, our roadmap to conservation for those species.
Okay, that sounds like a great resource. Are there efforts underway to do anything to recover the oaks that were lost in the mid-Atlantic?
Oh, I don't know. I hope so. I know that, I know that there have been there's been a lot of oak decline. Tim Boland last week mentioned some issues with fall army caterpillars. I think it was that had really decimated the oaks around Massachusetts. I'm sure that there are like conservation NGOs. I'm sure there are botanic gardens that are working to reestablish native oaks. I would just say reach out to your local garden or nature conservancy or native plant society, or your local protected area like your forest preserves, and see if you can volunteer there, see what they're doing, and find out if you can help. But yeah, I'm sure like oaks are so important in so many of our ecosystems that the loss of them is something that local land managers are likely trying to grapple with right now.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about non-native oaks. One specifically referencing English oaks. Are they an invasive problem here in the United States, or can they be planted? And are there any other non-native oak species that are becoming problematic?
There aren't any non-native oak species that are becoming really European buckthorn or tree of heaven level of problematic. There are some non-native oaks that can naturalize here. I don't think it's a huge risk, but again, invasive tendencies of plants is very region specific. So depending on where you are, look at like the state usually has a list of species that it's flagged. That's probably the USDA or APHIS has a list of species that it's flagged for invasive tendencies. So I would say check your state, and check with your local botanic garden to see if they do or do not recommend a certain species of non-native oak. But they don't generally cause problems to the scale that we've seen some of these other like massive problems with invasive plants from other regions. Interestingly, our red oak, Quercus rubra, is becoming kind of a problem in parts of Europe. And that's kind of funny that we don't really, at least I don't really think about that. And then you see it over there and you're like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. But oaks, I think, it's not hugely problematic. It is just becoming naturalized in areas. I don't know of any oaks globally that have been introduced somewhere else and are going absolutely crazy.
Okay. Are there any understory trees or understory plants or particular fungal species that are helpful in establishing a healthy oak grove? And do you have fungal recommendations that match particular oak species?
This is not my strong suit. I would again direct people to the research that Christy Rawlinson and Megan Midgley have done in the Center for Tree Science at the Morton Arboretum. So if you go to the Morton Arboretum's website and go to Center for Tree Science, you can see our scientists and the work that they do. And our forest ecologist is Christy Rawlinson, and our soil biologist is Megan Midgley. And together they've done some really interesting work on, what are some of the conditions under which oaks thrive the best. And also, but that's again in the Midwest. So, these things are very regional. There's going to be different recommendations for the Southeast as there are to where we are in Chicago as there are in the Southwest. But that might be a good place to start, especially if the question asker is local to here. Also, again, the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan that CRTI, Chicago Region Trees Initiative, put out might also address that question in terms of how to create the best conditions for oak ecosystem recovery here in the Midwest.
Okay. Is it possible for an arboretum to report newly planted wild collected Quercus accessions? Are you aware of any of those databases available?
Yes. So as of right now, the database where we track, the database with the best capability of tracking and reporting back, like a centralized database, reporting back what's growing in our collections, is a database called Plant Search, all one word, PLANT search. And it is managed by BGCI, by Botanic Gardens Conservation International. Right now, all that database will tell you is whether or not a garden has a particular species growing in its collection. So you could look up Quercus rubra and it would tell you that red oak is growing in 100 botanic gardens around the world. You can send a data request to find out exactly which botanic gardens and sign a data waiver and data permission form to find out exactly which species it's growing in, which gardens that species is growing in. But we are working with BGCI. BGCI is working to build out Plant Search so that it can get to the point where it can track accession level information, so that it can say not just 100 gardens have Quercus rubra, but 100 gardens have Quercus rubra, and the Morton Arboretum has 50 accessions of Quercus rubra from all of these different locations in the wild. And it can actually tell, and so that's what we are working towards. And that is our goal, is to be able to have a much more powerful and robust accessions level database, so that you can actually see if this is a particular population that has never been collected and conserved in botanic gardens, or if it's one that's represented everywhere and it's not really worth collecting again. That will be really exciting when we get to that point. Until we get there, we, the consortia, are managing that database in a slightly more sort of homemade organic way. So we gather the ex situ information and we compile this database, and we standardize it and we geolocate it at whatever individuals that we can. So right now there's a lot of labor that goes into creating that database. And it is available for some species and for some gardens. And that's one of the things that consortia are doing right now. And so that's what my team has done in partnership with BGCI to develop that collections. Another source to go to is and again, it's just for certain species, but the American Public Gardens Association Plant Collections Network has several multi-site institutions, and Oaks is one of them. And so there are 20 institutions in that site, and they also gather and standardize the ex situ data collections. In fact, that data set was what helped us start to create the BGCI Plant Search data module that will have accessions level information in it. So we're getting better at having that information available to everybody and sort of standardized and at our fingertips, but we're not quite there yet, but there are some ways to get it. So if someone's really interested, they can email me and I can help direct them.
Okay. When hybridization occurs in red oaks, are the offspring able to reproduce? And when collecting acorns for projects like this, how long does it take post-germination to tell if you've collected hybrids?
Great questions. As far as I know, yes, all red oaks that can reproduce with each other. So generally for oaks within a section, so the oak genus has 7 sections within a section. So the red oaks is one, the white oaks is another one. They can pretty much all hybridize and produce viable offspring. There may be 1 or 2 like pairwise exceptions to that, but within a section of oaks, they can hybridize and they produce fertile offspring. How long before you can tell? Usually pretty soon. You can tell if what you have is a hybrid if you plant it out. That's generally what our curators do when we do a big collecting trip. We'll sow out, 100 acorns, and within the first growing season or 2, our curator can identify ones that just look funny and yoink them out. So it's certainly doable. The problem is where you have a lot of co-occurring species and a lot of just naturally occurring morphological variation, and you get these species complexes like what we have in Southwest Texas, where things kind of grade into each other. And you can also have a plant that looks, an individual plant that looks one way one year because it was maybe a wet or a dry spring, and then the leaves look different next year. They can look different over the course of the same season. So like leaves look like one way in spring and they flush again in the fall and they look totally different. You can even have leaves on the same plant that look quite different. So oaks love morphological plasticity and variation. So that's kind of a constant challenge for us. And one of those research projects that I described was kind of trying to pick that apart and understand a bit more about, is something a true species? Is there hybridization going on? Or is it just a lot of morphological variation?
So to prevent hybrids, do you suggest if planting a grove that only one species should be planted?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, that's the easiest and most obvious way to prevent hybridization. If you're planting a conservation grove for the purposes of generating acorns that will go back into the wild. And that's sort of how we are assuming it's going to work. And that's, our kind of recommendations for now. We want to actually conduct a lot more, once we get more of these really focused conservation groves into the ground that are actually reproducing, we want to conduct a lot of the like DNA fingerprinting to see how much hybridization actually happens. And like at what rates, and is there a way to plant a conservation grove, let's say with a lot of trees in a cluster, and if you collect acorns off some of the central trees in that cluster, do you have a pretty good chance that they're all going to be pollinated by the other trees that are nearby, or do you get pollen from the oak that was half a mile away? Because that's possible. But I think, yeah, if you plant them where there aren't other species in the same section that can hybridize, that's great. You've at least pretty confidently what you've got. But it's okay. It's okay to plant these conservation groves where you have other oaks. Like I showed you the picture of our conservation grove is actually going in our oak collection, where we have 100 other taxa of oaks, all from all over the world, from the US and from Asia. And we're going to pursue a lot of different avenues for how to get that germplasm back into the wild and make sure that what we have is sort of pure. We're going to try controlled pollinations. We can also try just like sowing out acorns and then visually pulling out the things that look like hybrids. We can also do the like actual DNA fingerprinting to say, is this what we wanted it to be, before we go and reintroduce that seedling back into the wild.
Okay. Can you give us an example of a less common oak that we could be planting along the East Coast?
Oh, I am not so familiar with what commonly planted oaks along the East Coast would be. I would say email Tim that question. Tim Boland, who gave this webinar last week, who's based at Holly Hill Arboretum, he is a big fan of oaks of the Eastern US, and I'm sure he would be very happy to talk to you and give suggestions.
Great idea. We are running out of time, but there's one wonderful comment that I wanted to share. One of our listeners grew up in Europe, and they lived close to a 1,000-year-old oak.
Ooh,
So she has a particular affinity for oaks.
that's so
So,
great. I
so
actually have a book of old iconic oaks of Britain, and it's like, and each page is a different oak that is hundreds, potentially 1,000 years old, all throughout the United Kingdom. And I actually lived in the UK for 10 years, and I'm married to a Brit, and I really want to go on a tour of ancient English oaks at some point. So maybe that listener wants to join me.
that sounds like a wonderful adventure. So thank you so much for sharing all of this excellent information. It's really inspired us to go and look into our forests and check out these resources that you shared on the resource page. And we've learned a great deal from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.